Yeah, well, hi, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. Yeah, and I apologize for missing the morning. We're still teaching. It's our last week, our second to last class. So, but I told people I'd bring back information, so I flipped some of your sheet, Jen. I'll bring back. Thank you for that. Yeah, and so I'll be talking some about adapting plant health management and thinking about scaling and opportunities for shared lessons learned. So I think one sometimes shortcoming of our discipline is that people get in their silos based on what species they work with. And so one thing I was thinking about is how to have broader tools that and perspectives that we can use. So I'll talk a little bit about adaptation to climate change, this idea of disaster plant ecology that encompasses also civil unrest, other types of human-driven disasters, the toolbox that we're working on to try to have a easy approach for rapid risk assessment. And then something I haven't thought about that much, but we've had on the back burner and maybe is interesting to you, sort of developing a map of adaptation possibilities for plant health management. So how can we adapt to climate change? And so here, just some quick overview, right? For growers, they can think about early warning systems, varieties, adapting cultural practices. For crop breeders, researchers, so part of this is like longer term decision making. What do we anticipate? What diseases will we need to prioritize where? And then similarly for policymakers, donors, they can also think about financial tools like insurance that might buffer farmers with potential issues as well, for possibility of perverse incentives. So not necessarily an easy solution. Yeah, and as Jim was talking about, it's interesting, when can we really be confident that events that we see are due to climate change versus all the other factors that influence all the other things that are changing, management changes in varieties, changes in pathogen populations. So this is an interesting example of having a really big data set and the potential to separate out effects of different kinds of changes and attribute some share of that change to climate change. So that's interesting. Maybe that's interesting for us to think about what sorts of, because I'm not aware of an analysis like this for the US, so we should have one, right? So something to think about, can we bring together the data sets that we have available and approach an analysis like this for the country over decades? There are a lot of different kinds of data sets that could be interesting. They all have their issues, right? Like breeders data sets where they might have inoculated, so maybe it's not quite a natural system. Or pesticide trials, same thing, they might have done something, so it's not just what you see in the natural conditions. But it could be pretty interesting to try to bring together data sets that we have for an analysis like this. Then another approach that pathologists often take is looking at, because there's no doubt that weather affects disease risk, right? So then it's just a question, can we attribute climate change, which is changing weather, can we say that that's changing disease? So another approach people take sometimes is extrapolating. If we have some kind of estimates, right, of the temperatures that are conducive for a particular pathogen, then we can extrapolate and then see what happens globally. Like, so in this study, people found some of these general favorability temperatures for 80-ish pathogens, and then you can extrapolate to what would be happening globally under climate change scenarios. So plant pathologists often have these kinds of forecasting models that have been tested pretty strenuously, right? Because it's whether or not growers can use them, and growers would quickly become disillusioned if it doesn't work very well. So a really sort of strict type of validation for disease forecasting models that are used for short-term decision making by growers. So then you can extrapolate that. Also see, so one factor we often see, especially like in the tropics, is pathogens moving up in elevation. So that's one potential risk, a common feature. And then it's also an issue since often seed production might be in those higher elevations too. And also then higher elevations might be more fragile ecosystems where you can't really just keep pushing into them with production. Then for decision support systems, there are lots of different potential types of adaptation. You got an old decision support system that's useful if you're pushing it with new environments that it wasn't necessarily designed based on, that might not have been part of the statistical support for the original development of it. The old system might not be useful any longer, but you can also imagine scenarios where maybe it wasn't useful in the past, but it becomes useful now that the patterns of severity shift. And then another sort of response, resistance genes and their availability in crop development globally. You can think about how well those systems are put in place for support of resistance genes where they're needed in viable varieties when they're needed. So coming back to the idea of prediction in advance of what diseases will be important. And one project I think is pretty inspiring is this proposed global surveillance system for crop diseases. So developed by people in CGIAR. Well, so they don't, as I understand it, CGIAR doesn't stand for anything anymore, but it did stand for Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. So CGIAR as a leader in developing this sort of globally coordinated systems. But of course, it's very expensive. And I guess to some extent we're emphasizing the US in this meeting, I guess, but then of course pathogens don't respect borders, so it's useful to think about the world anyway, right? And so here in this is sort of synthesis we did, climate change effects on pathogen emergence, and thinking about what sort of response we would like to have to that. So this is sort of a dream of what we could hope to have in a fantastic system where everybody's well-funded and coordinated. So the idea that we'd have all these data layers that could feed into our models, we'd have these models developed, we'd have image libraries, so we could be doing image analysis to support assessment of disease spread. We'd have links between disease severity or other measures of disease levels and yield loss, which often are missing, surprisingly. And then we'd have the decision support tools to translate those models. And there'd be data sharing linked together and providing and updating all these systems based on feedback around how useful they were. So a nice system to think about. And then it's also interesting to think about if you can't have it all, what are the most important components? Another question, what are the most important parts to start building? And the interesting concept, I think, in that context is the value of information, also the cost of information. So if you're making a decision, you can think about the value of the information in terms of how much better the outcome is from the decision. And then is the cost of acquiring that data justified now when you can define well? But then you also have to think about the cost in the future, so you're not just putting out fires, right? So can you anticipate that the value of the information you're collecting would be justified in the long run? So of course you can think back to the idea that you'd like to have decades of data to evaluate, partition out what is the role of climate change. So you have to have made that long-term investment to do this sort of long-term syntheses as well. So here's a case where we're looking at some in the context of potato seed health management and looking at the value of information for decision making there. Then we're thinking about the concept of disaster plant topology. So as Jim was talking about, extreme events can lead to pathogen introductions. I forget if you mentioned, Jim, but the example I always think of is the soybean rust pathogen likely introduced into the US by a hurricane. So that's a pretty dramatic event. So if these extreme events become more common, the sort of introduction of them may become more common as well. It's also interesting because it's tied into weeds like everything. Since kudzu is a host, right? And so if kudzu is moving north also, and then it can overwinter more easily in kudzu, because it's the same pattern like Jim was talking about, where it overwinters and then invades in the north each year. So in the disaster plant pathology, we're thinking about a synthesis of these sorts of issues and the different sorts sorts of disasters and how they influence disease risk. So pulse disasters that might occur, like a hurricane or something like that, crust disasters that are longer term, but can be building in their effects, and then what the sorts of responses to them need to be. So I won't get into the details, but this idea that if you want to have a management system for disaster response, you need, well, in a lot of places we're thinking about seed systems are really an issue, especially if there's a disaster, so the seed is wiped out in a region, there might not be a good system for getting safe seed to replace the seed that was lost. So good seed systems, resilient quality assurance and response protocols, disaster preparedness, and the institutions to support that, human capacity building, and decision support systems to support the human responses. People are also referencing the idea of fire. So this is a project that's a bit on the edge of what I often think about, but it's pretty interesting to look at human pathogens that are present in smoke from wildfires. And so the loop hasn't been closed as far as I know, like to prove human pathogens, dispersion smoke have caused infection, but there's some circumstantial evidence for that happening. So another issue, and then of course the One Health perspective, there are a lot of different pathogens in smoke, and the potential for the fact that smoke is also an irritant might make change how vulnerable hosts are to the pathogens as well. And so we've been thinking about in this disaster plant pathology context too, about the concept of the National Plant Health Risk Analysis. Of course, the US has very really well built and well maintained National Plant Health Risk Analysis, but we're also thinking about for countries that haven't invested as much as the US, what are some components of what that can be like? Like one project we're looking at in Cameroon and Ethiopia, we're looking at using some different tools for this National Plant Health Risk Analysis. So like Cameroon and Ethiopia have, here's a map of some disasters. So there are a lot of issues, right, that, well, we're fortunate in the US that we're not dealing with some of these, right? But then the combination of issues like flooding, then combined with armed conflict is a real challenge for management. And of course, the armed conflicts can have as part of their causation climate change too, as it's affecting the other issues that put stresses on human communities. So here we're looking at sort of like the diagram before of what you'd like to have in a system, but here we're looking specifically at humanitarian activities and what kind of data you want to feed into humanitarian activities, with some emphasis on seed and having a good healthy seed source and being able to figure out what is your healthy seed source if you're in somewhat of a crisis situation. And so then this toolbox that we've been working on. So I love this. It might not all be, I will go through it quickly since it might not all be exactly of interest to this group. But I think it's a good challenge to think about building a toolbox instead of just analyzing a system, to try to, again, go along with this idea of scaling up and thinking about how you can have lessons learned across different projects. So here we've been talking about this R2M toolbox, rapid risk assessment to support mitigation of crop diseases and pests. So our goal here is to make the most of existing data and knowledge, and think about the best way to combine these different approaches into useful, to provide useful information, like in the context of this. Like if you have humanitarian activities that have to be implemented, then what kind of analysis of plant health risks can feed into that most directly? It's really interesting for us, like working with this too, to see how the things that we would naturally want to know as plant pathologists they don't really hook up necessarily that well with what people need for humanitarian decision making. So it's interesting to think about how to better link those together. But so in this R2M toolbox, looking at expert knowledge elicitation, cropland or habitat connectivity analyses, scenario analyses, trade network analyses, and then think about climate-based risk to broaden some of the analyses as well. So the idea of expert knowledge elicitation, so if you want to think about a Bayesian framework, could be in effect characterizing the prior, what people think, how people think the system works, what experts think is a parameter value, like disease severity in this particular location for this particular disease on average, or across the past 5 years, or whatever you're interested in, or in the future, right? So we've been working to try to improve some tools for this and develop an app so that we have a question catalog we're developing for plant health, and that the app can draw on those to make it easier to implement quickly for somebody that's using it for the first time. Then GeoHabNet and our package for habitat connectivity analysis. So we've used that some for cropland connectivity, which is pretty easy since there are databases around of varying quality, where different crops are available. So if you got a crop specific pathogen or pest, then you could see where the likely hubs or potential spread through a region, or bridges, like if they're separate habitat areas, the bridges that could connect them. So we prepared this R package to make it easier to use in sort of a systematic way. And then as a management, like regional management analysis tool, we've been working on this impact network analysis approach. So decision support for regional management interventions. So it's an R package, and we're working on an online app for that too, to make it easier to use. So the idea that you've got a set of people, or in our case, let's say farm managers. So a set of people who are linked together, influencing each other, making decisions about how farms will be managed, and whether to use a certain sort of technology maybe for management. And then the biophysical network, which in our case then would be, say, farms. So there's a manager, a farm. Of course, not always that simple, but so a manager deciding whether to use management, farm where that management is used or not, and then the outcome for the epidemic of all those cumulative traces, like is there herd immunity because enough people decided to use management. So that sort of idea of capturing those components of a system. And so the R package allows you to characterize the system if you know something about what networks would be like, and then play around with different scenarios for what would happen. So like one consideration would be if you give it some kind of a policy with an incentive for management, so maybe 20% more people end up using this effective management, what are the likely outcomes for the system? So we're asking questions using that, like what locations are particularly important for system management if you're figuring out where it's most important to give a subsidy, something like that. Are the benefits equally distributed? How would different subsidies and policies work? You can characterize what these networks are like, depending on the type of network. They could have really different properties in terms of how important management at one location is. And then here's an example that I think is interesting, maybe hard to implement, because it might be hard to have enough information to implement with confidence. The idea here is that on the x-axis, mean probability of establishment for pathogen, let's say pests, suppose that's going up over time because of climate change. And then the other axis, mean adoption rate required. So that's a mean adoption rate required to keep the same level of risk of regional establishment. So the idea being that if it is a probability of establishment goes up because the environment's more conducive, then how many more people have to adopt this good management to keep the same level of risk for the region? So it's maybe a good practice to, even though, of course, the results will have a lot of uncertainty, but maybe it's a good practice to try to think about that, or if we think that different kinds of management will counterbalance greater risk due to climate change or other factors. So here's an example if you want to see for laurel wilt in Florida. If you're not familiar with that, it was a massive problem in avocado in Florida. Well, it's an interesting case of how complicated agriculture is, though, because we were just talking with people and saying like, well, a lot of people went out of business because of laurel wilt, but now the people who are still in business, they changed production, they're actually doing well. So it's kind of interesting about how hard to predict it is that the system ended up being resilient for those who could survive. But this paper looks at some different scenarios for the issue of decision-making for emerging epidemics. Well, and sort of highlights the idea that the early part of an epidemic or a new invasion, people might be motivated to try to get by without doing anything because they have a pretty good chance, like there's a pretty good chance they won't get the disease. They might be wiped out, but there's a pretty good chance they won't get wiped out. So there's incentive not to bother managing. So this gives an example of that for the avocado laurel wilt case.
It's a great title.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You know, there's another our avocados toast out there. I forget what the topic was. Something avocados have a number of problems. But so they're not toast after all, even though it looked like the things were really declining. Well, just as an aside, because it's so interesting, it used to be a lifestyle thing in Florida. You could have an avocado orchard that was kind of a forest, and you could live there and not have to do that much and just have a good life, harvest the avocado. But then with laurel wilt, it sort of trashed that because now the effective production systems are small, young trees that are separate from each other, you know, that aren't as beautiful, and you wouldn't really live among them. Complicated story. So here's another example looking at a potato seed system in the Republic of Georgia and integrating some of these tools, and likewise the potato seed systems in Ethiopia. Oh, an old slide. It's out now if you want to see an agricultural system. And so I'm interested in building this kind of toolbox with others who are doing related tool development to think about what kind of synergies we could get. And then I was just going to mention this, so I should say, like, this is just why I put in there. It's definitely back of the envelope thinking, but it does seem like maybe it would be a useful sort of tool to develop some for a map. So map of plant health management. So the idea, again, to develop synergies through lessons learned across systems, and with the idea that a map like this could be used to compare options for climate change adaptation across capital systems. So maybe interesting to you all to think about. We've been just brainstorming on it a little bit at UF, but if other people find this interesting, or maybe have thought about something similar, or know of somebody having already done it, click on all this first. I know there have been different efforts in plant disease epidemiology to make like a periodic table of pathogens, things like that, but I'm not sure what the good examples are of results of those kind of efforts. This isn't a periodic table of pathogens sort of thing. It's more of plant health management options. And so I was thinking about it partly if you know this MapMan diagram for. So when people started getting a lot of gene expression data, they were trying to think about how to express it some way, since it's complicated, just like plant health management system. So the idea, if you know something about the metabolic structure, and then you can, then the circles here indicate something about gene expression, you know, like is it higher or lower or modified by a treatment, things like that. So I was thinking about something similar to like that as a map for plant health management. So again, back to the envelope. So it would look something like this, that it would have all these different plant management features like on-farm management, regional management, which gets into research, breeding, and then global management kind of components too. And then for each of those, for what sort of climate change adaptation is possible or needed, like the dots could mean different things. Well, one thing could just be like A here, the availability of this type of management for a particular ecosystem. But another sort of climate change adaptation could be like no adaptation needed, or maybe it's not possible, maybe it's needed but not possible, or management becomes more important or becomes less important. So thinking about that some with like this ultimate goal, like but we have more of these categories here, was kind of interesting to me to think about how do you adapt plant health management to climate change. Oh, I wanted to mention that American Phytopathological Society is considering a potential climate summit for looking at plant health and climate. So maybe there are interesting synergies with this group as well. This is not a very concrete idea yet, but think about maybe something fall 2025. And well, and also at another APS activity, we were looking for good examples of successful climate change adaptation for plant health, and kind of hard to find one. Well, because there's all the problem of attribution. Well, was this really problem caused by climate change in the first place? And then like nice examples where people said like, yes, this is being caused by climate change, and this is how we will adapt management to address it, and our strategy work. Like nice examples of that. So that'd be interesting to discuss if we have nice examples like that, or if we don't, or how we could develop them. So thanks for listening.
All right, questions for Garrett? Marty.
Yeah, Karen, Marty Williams. Your presentation blew me away because it has this social science component of it that is just really neat, and something that in plant pathology, which I'm in weed science, so I'm just kind of curious. Most of the things you described, it seemed like kind of were describing patterns or connections from pathology to growers or individuals. I think were there, and I mean, maybe this is what you're alluding to here. Are you also trying to, or have you done work where you've tried to like change behavior that in the production or other realms and been able to move that needle, or is that really not the aim of these examples that you presented?
Of changing what people do.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I'm thinking for herbicide resistance is a major issue we have in weed science, and we can do all kinds of science. We can do all kinds of things that, we document a case of resistance in our weed population. But a lot of it gets down to, changing how growers use herbicides. And we have fabulous extension weed scientists that have been sharing, they've got science down, they're communicating, even some of the companies are on board, but still it's not moved the needle on herbicide resistance developing. So I'm just curious. So so this is why I'm not in social science. I feel like, all right, I give up, let me just work on my weeds. But I'm just curious with the examples you presented there. Was there anything that was it mainly describing how things work, or would your work take it to that step of like using that to then change behavior? I guess that's my question.
Oh, well, so like in this context, we were looking at like if there's a disaster and there's a need for clean seed. So there we're collaborating with humanitarian organizations. I guess that's a level above individual grower decision making, but it's more like humanitarian operation decision making, and there actually are some bad stories about distributing, not even just in a crisis, but an immediate crisis, but distributing seed that had this one good trait, but it was introducing this pathogen at the same time. So there are stories like that. So like to convince people to be more cautious about that. Oh, but if you're thinking about this or like this kind of system, and then the laurel wilt example. So well, and maybe this is a common problem too. We had enough data to start to think about it when it was like a ways into the epidemic. So we had some of the same issues. Like we were able to think about it more once we knew enough more after the epidemic had been going for a while. So that's that was more of an issue where it's like a post. But yeah, I mean there are examples in plant pathology. Well, Neil will probably talk about some where people were able to cooperate well, or like I was talking about a green bridge, like or a bridge for epidemics, but people have been able to break up like temporal green bridges, like cooperate, just nobody plants during this period, and then the pathogen will die out, and then so people sometimes do cooperate like that, or there's a new project, I guess, with wheat breeding where people cooperate about where they deploy resistance gene. So there are some hopeful examples. It seems like all of those took a huge amount of work though to get them actually implemented.
Well, maybe you're
So I hate to cut discussion off right now, but we've just found out that we have to be out of the room at 4:30.
Oh, sure.
So we're not gonna get 3 presentations in yet this afternoon. Any of the, Neil, Allison, Peter, any of you have any objections to holding back and going tomorrow morning?